If you stand near Edinburgh today, you'll find a massive monolith known as the Keystone. Most people walk past it, but it's actually a fossilized memory of a man the world has forgotten. Long before the French poets turned him into a boorish knight, he was a monster slayer of the Hen Ogledd. This is the investigation into the northern historical placement of Sir Kay and the political spin that tried to erase his true origin. Welcome back to the Hidden Roundtable.
And frankly, if you want a masterclass in historical character assassination, Sir Kay is, well, he's patient zero.
He really is?
Right. I mean, we are talking about a man who has suffered through centuries of just deliberate, weaponized PR spin. Much like the debate we had over Merlin's historical trauma in episode 2, we are seeing a really similar distortion happening right here.
Yeah, the scale of it is wild.
It is. Because the shining Camelot version of Kay, the petty, incompetent foster brother whose only literary purpose is to just make Arthur look magnanimous, that is a complete and utter fabrication.
Absolutely. And I was looking through the source pile we've assembled for this investigation, and the sheer scale of the historical erasure, it's just staggering.
Staggering is the right word for it.
So our mission for today's deep dive is fundamentally different from what we've been doing lately. We've spent a lot of time looking at overarching strategic maps, right? The broad movements of tribes in sub-Roman Britain.
Big picture stuff.
Exactly. But today we are putting a single, highly contested character under the forensic microscope. We are pulling Arthur's earliest, most formidable companion out of those polished, perfumed halls of French chivalric romance.
And good riddance to them.
Right. And we are dragging him back into the mud, the freezing rain, and the volcanic stone of the northern strongholds.
Which honestly is exactly where he belongs. Because if we were going to find the historical nucleus of the man, you have to completely jettison the medieval European aesthetic. Just throw it out. You have to forget the jousting tournaments. The shiny plate armor. Instead, you have to step into the geopolitical sandbox of what the early Britons called the Hen Ogledd, the Old North.
So let's define that sandbox for you, because the political geography is crucial to wrap your head around here. When the texts refer to the Old North, we're talking about the early 5th century.
Right.
The Roman administration has just collapsed. In 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius basically sends a letter to Britain saying, look to your own defenses. We are not sending the legions back.
Best of luck, you're on your own.
Exactly. The Roman war machine pulls out entirely, and it leaves behind this massive, terrifying power vacuum in what is now northern England and southern Scotland.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah, and what fills that vacuum is not some unified, patriotic nation holding hands.
No, not at all. It is a constellation of highly aggressive, highly localized Brittonic kingdoms.
They were essentially at each other's throats.
Oh, constantly. You have Strathclyde over in the west, Red down in the Cumbria region, Elmet over in Yorkshire, and crucially, for our subject today, Gododin in the east.
Done.
Right. Gododin was centered right on the imposing volcanic rock of Din Aiden, which, well, you and I would recognize today as Edinburgh Castle.
I was mapping these kingdoms out based on the archaeological surveys and paranoid rival corporations. That feels like the best way to describe them.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Right, because they shared a common language, Cumbric, which is a Brittonic variety it's an ancient cousin to Old Welsh. They even called themselves the Cymry, meaning the fellow countrymen.
Right, they had a shared identity on paper.
But they were completely surrounded by hostile takeovers. You've got the Picts constantly pushing down from the northern highlands. You had the Gaels, the Scoti, launching naval raids from the west.
Don't forget the east.
Right, and the Anglo-Saxons are beginning their relentless generational push from the eastern shores.
So it is a state of perpetual, grinding, existential warfare. There is no central government to bail you out. If your local warlord fails to hold the line, your entire society is enslaved or slaughtered. That's the reality.
And sitting right at the bleeding edge of that frontier, functioning essentially as the shield for the rest of the island, is the Kingdom of Gododin.
The human shield.
Yeah. Now, the archaeology shows that the Gododin were the direct descendants of an Iron Age tribe called the Votadini. And what's fascinating about the Votadini is that the Romans didn't just conquer them and leave them be.
No, they were far too useful for that.
Exactly. They used them for centuries as a highly militarized pro-Roman buffer state.
They were the mercenaries of the empire.
Right.
A client kingdom.
Right.
The Romans essentially paid the Votadini to be the bouncers at the northern edge of the civilized world.
Bouncers, I love that. And that perfectly sets up the earliest literary references we have for Kay. Because when you dig into the archaic Welsh and Cumbric strata, centuries before any French poet gets a hold of him, he is known as Kai, or Kai Feb Senor.
Kai Feb Senor, yeah.
And his specific title, his designated operational role in Arthur's retinue, is repeatedly listed as the Porter.
The Porter. And here is where the historical establishment fundamentally dropped the ball for generations.
Totally missed the mark.
Completely. Because a 19th century Victorian historian, or a modern reader for that matter, hears the word porter, and they immediately think of a guy carrying luggage at a hotel.
Right, carrying some lord's bags.
Or at best, maybe a doorman checking IDs at the entrance of a mead hall.
It sounds like a glorified servant.
Right, it sounds domestic. But think about the sheer brutality of the landscape we just described. Does it make any logical sense that Arthur's top guy, his most lethal and trusted companion in a world of constant warfare, is a bellhop?
Obviously not.
It's a profound mistranslation. And not necessarily of the word itself, but of the geopolitical reality behind the word.
So how should we be translating it then? If we reframe the Votadini not as domestic servants, but as the literal gatekeepers of the remnants of the Roman province of Britannia, what does that make a porter?
Well, it makes him the Minister of Defense.
Wow.
It makes him the Supreme Commander of Border Security. I mean, a porter in the context of the Hen Ogledd isn't opening a wooden door to let guests into a banquet. He is controlling the flow of Caledonian and Pictish tribes through the strategic geographical choke points of the north.
The choke point.
Yeah. He's the man holding the gate at Aiden.
That paints such a different picture. I mean, picture yourself standing on that volcanic rock in the year 450 AD. You're looking north across the Firth of Forth into the fog.
Freezing fog, usually.
Right. And you know that every major raiding party, every invasion force coming out of the Highlands, has to go through your territory first to get to the richer lands down south.
They have to go through you.
That has to be the most strategically terrifying job in the entire country.
Oh, without a doubt. But the thing is, they were incredibly well equipped to handle it.
Right. This wasn't some peasant militia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to look at the excavations from Traprain Law.
Traprain Law, yes.
Which was the ancient tribal capital of the Votadini, just east of Edinburgh. The 19th century idea was that these were desperate, ragged militias holding off the barbarians with, like, rusted pitchforks.
Which is such a lingering myth.
It is, but the archaeology shatters that narrative completely.
The Traprain Law hoard. I was reading the excavation reports for this deep dive, and the sheer volume of wealth pulled out of the ground there is astonishing.
That's unbelievable.
They found over 50 pounds of crushed and chopped up Roman silver plate, what archaeologists call hacksilver, alongside hoards of Gallic coins.
Over 50 pounds. And that hacksilver is the key here. They were literally chopping up priceless Roman silver dishes and using them as bullion to pay professional soldiers.
Like cold, hard cash.
Exactly. This proves the Votadini were highly funded by the fading Roman military administration. They possessed serious sustained capital.
They weren't scraping by.
No, they had economic stability, which, is the only way a society can afford to develop a specialized professional warrior elite that doesn't have to spend its time farming.
So when the archaic texts refer to Kai as the porter, we need to completely erase the image of a servant. We have to visualize a high-status, heavily armed, professionally trained military commander operating a sophisticated defensive network that was heavily subsidized by Roman wealth.
Precisely. You nailed it.
But, okay, that raises a massive question.
Go ahead.
Wait, if we establish these guys were defending a freezing rock against massive Pictish invasions and doing it with immense structured authority, where does a 5th century Brittonic warlord actually get that authority? Because you don't just, declare yourself the supreme commander of the northern buffer zone out of nowhere. To understand that, we have to look at the ghost of the Roman military engine that he inherited.
You're talking about his name.
Yes, the name. Because the linguistic data in our source pile is completely unambiguous on this. I was looking at the etymological breakdowns, and the name Kai isn't some ancient Celtic mystical name.
No, it's not.
Linguists insist it is the direct, regular Brittonic phonetic development of the very standard Roman name Caius or Gaius.
Right. And we need to explain why that matters to you listening, because it's not just a fun trivia fact. Onomastics, which is the study of names, you can think of a name as a linguistic fossil.
A fossil, exactly.
The way the Latin name Caius decays over centuries into the Brittonic Kai follows strict, observable phonetic rules.
You can track the math on it?
You can track it perfectly. This onomastic bridge proves the character didn't just pop out of thin air in a 12th century French manuscript.
It proves he was an aristocrat or a high-ranking military officer deeply embedded in the Romanized environment of the northern frontier.
Exactly. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman military wasn't sending fresh legions from Italy anymore. They were relying heavily on locally recruited auxiliary units, the limitani, to maintain order on the frontiers.
The border guards.
Yes. These were Britons who thought of themselves as Roman citizens, commanding Roman military structures.
And there's a specific title associated with this era that scholars constantly bring up in relation to the Arthurian command structure.
I know where you're going with this.
The Magister Draconium, the commander of the dragon standard.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back here.
Push back, let's hear it.
That is a massive leap. Look, Magister Draconium is a highly specific, documented Roman military rank.
It is.
Are we actually looking at a parchment that says Caius, Magister Draconium, or are we just making a wild guess based on his later association with Arthur?
Well, it's not a wild guess. It's a deduction based on the surviving military heraldry of the region. The Roman cavalry adopted the Draco standard from the Sarmatians. It was this hollow windsock shaped like a dragon that hissed as the cavalry charged.
Right, the wind goes through the metal head and hisses.
Exactly. And the officer responsible for this unit was the Magister Draconium. So if we connect this to the overarching imagery of the Arthurian mythos, what is the defining symbol of Arthur's family?
Uther Pendragon, the chief dragon.
Right, Pendragon, the chief dragon standard. This strongly suggests that Arthur's inner circle, his so-called knights, weren't chivalric lords on horseback looking for holy grails.
No, absolutely not.
They were the sub-Roman officers. They were the remnants of the Roman military structure, holding the line as the empire dissolves behind them, and retaining those Roman cavalry titles to project legitimacy.
Okay, I see the logic there. You lean on the Roman military titles like Caius to project authority to the local tribes who still respect the ghost of Rome.
Right.
But I still need physical proof.
You want the receipts.
I want the receipts. How do we bridge the gap between abstract Roman military titles and the physical reality of a Brittonic warlord?
We bridge it with the architecture. We have physical archaeological evidence of this transition from Roman military infrastructure to Brittonic myth.
Okay, lay it out.
Let's look at a site called Caergae, located over in North Wales. Historically, it is a 1st century Roman auxiliary fort.
1st century.
But its medieval Brittonic name translates literally to Kai's fort.
And inside this fort, during excavations, archaeologists found a stone inscription dedicated by a Roman soldier.
Yes.
A man named Julius Gavaronus, who was Miles, a soldier of the cohors Nerviorum, the first cohort of the Nerviae.
Right, which proves the Roman military occupation of the site.
But again, I have to play the skeptic here.
Of course.
You are pointing to an inscription from a 1st century Roman cohort in Wales, and you're trying to use it to prove the identity of a 5th century warlord operating hundreds of miles away in Scotland.
I know how it sounds.
How does a stone carved centuries before Kai was even born prove anything about his historical reality?
That is the exact question the historians wrestled with when they found it. It seems entirely contradictory until you understand the mechanism of cultural continuity and the psychological reuse of space.
Elaborate on that.
By the time the post-Roman period rolls around, that specific fort at Caergae still retained its massive, imposing stone walls.
Right, it hadn't just washed away.
Exactly. It was a structural marvel compared to the timber halls of the era. Now imagine you are a retreating northern elite a century or two later.
Okay.
Your kingdoms in the Hen Ogledd are falling to the Anglo-Saxons. You are pushed out of your ancestral lands in the north, and you migrate south to Wales as a high-status refugee.
A warlord on the run.
Right. Where are you going to set up your new court?
Well, you're not going to build a new timber fort from scratch in the mud. You're going to occupy the most defensible, imposing stone structure you can find.
Precisely. And you map your northern heroes, your ancestral legends, onto the physical ruins of the empire. You take this massive stone fortress left behind by Rome, and you rename it. You say, this is Caergae. This is the home of our legendary northern commander, Kai.
It's a psychological scaffolding.
Yes. It grounds their myth in physical reality. There's actually a 15th century Welsh poet, Tudor Penllyn, who wrote extensively about this area.
Tudor Penllyn, right.
And for him, the landscape wasn't just old rocks. It was completely saturated with returning legend. The local Welsh population didn't view those ruins as distant, irrelevant Roman history. They viewed them as the active, historical dwellings of their own ancestral heroes.
It's like formatting a hard drive, but the old data refuses to be completely deleted.
That's a great way to put it.
Or better yet, think of it like modern military bases in conflict zones today.
Okay, how so?
A superpower builds a massive fortified base with airstrips and bunkers. Years later, geopolitical winds shift and they withdraw. The local militia forces immediately move in, they take over the infrastructure, and they rename the base after their own generals.
They rebrand it.
Exactly. The psychological power of occupying that space gives them immediate, tangible legitimacy in the eyes of the locals.
That is a perfect analogy. And Kai, or Caius, represented that legitimacy. He was the ghost of the professional military rigor of Rome, devolved into the gritty, muddy survivalism of the sub-Roman North.
And if you want to understand just how gritty and muddy that survivalism actually was, we have to put down the archaeological reports for a second and open up the poetry.
The poetry is incredible.
Because the poetry is where the polished, romanticized veneer gets completely blasted away by the brutal reality of the era. We need to look at the Black Book of Carmarthen.
Right, I have the translations right here. Specifically, we need to examine an archaic poem called Pagur Ev Porthar, which translates to "Who is the porter?"
This poem is the smoking gun for the northern placement theory.
It really is.
Because it doesn't place Kai in some mythical, nebulous fairyland or a shining castle in the south. It explicitly places him at Aiden on the borders.
In Aiden.
It anchors him directly to the Rock of Edinburgh, fighting localized defensive campaigns.
But the way he's described in this poem is where things get wild and where a lot of modern readers get completely thrown off.
Oh yeah, this is where people tap out.
He is depicted as a literal giant, a long man.
No.
The text says he could grow as tall as the tallest tree in the forest.
Right.
It describes him battling this monstrous, terrifying figure named Garlwat. He says he slaughters 9 witches.
9 witches, yeah.
He fights creatures called the Sinbin, which translates to the dog heads. And perhaps weirdest of all, he has this bizarre supernatural ability where his hands generate so much intense heat that they keep his companions warm in the freezing cold.
And here is where we have to do the work of historians. We have to aggressively strip the magic away from the poetry.
Because it's too easy to dismiss.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For a long time, a lot of 19th century antiquarians read these stanzas, threw their hands up, and dismissed the whole thing as mythological crankery.
Crankery.
They thought, well, there are literal giants and wizards here, so this has zero historical value. Toss it in the bin.
But that completely ignores how oral cultures record history.
Exactly. If you read this through the lens of a 5th century military commander operating in a state of total war, you aren't reading fairy tales. You are reading harsh political reality translated into the hyperbole of oral tradition.
Okay, let's decode it line by line for the listener.
Let's do it.
The Sinbin, the dogheads. What is the political reality of a doghead?
Well, they aren't literal werewolf monsters roaming the Scottish borders.
Right.
Dogheads is a derogatory, terrifying epithet for fierce, non-Britannic raiders coming out of the Highlands or the Western Isles.
The Picts, the Scots.
Yes. These were vicious, irregular infantry, terrifying the Romanized Britons. To a disciplined sub-Roman soldier holding a shield wall, a screaming Highlander covered in woad or animal skins might as well be a monster.
They dehumanized the enemy.
Exactly. It's psychological warfare.
And what about the 9 witches he slaughters?
Again, that's not a coven of hags casting spells over a cauldron in the woods. That represents a highly specific pagan resistance, or maybe a diverse coalition of enemy threats.
So the 9 represents factions.
Right. The poets used mythological supernatural language to describe the sheer overwhelming terror of the human enemies they were facing. When your society is on the brink of annihilation, your enemies become demons.
That makes so much sense. And what about the long man imagery? Was he just, a remarkably tall guy?
He might have been physically imposing, sure. I mean, in a malnourished post-Roman population, a well-fed aristocrat standing 6'4" would look like a giant.
A towering figure.
But tall as a tree is more likely a metaphor for his outsized strategic impact. He cast a massive shadow over the defense of the realm.
That brings us to my favorite part of the poem, the supernatural thermal regulation.
The human space heater.
Yes. The idea that his hands kept his companions warm. When I first read that, it sounded like a comic book superpower.
I love this detail because it is so incredibly grounded when you actually think about the environment.
Walk us through that.
It is not a magical superpower. It is a mythologized memory of extreme winter survival skills. Think about the topography we are dealing with. You are marching through the freezing, soaking, wet Scottish bogs in November.
Miserable.
Survival in that scenario isn't about magic. It's about knowing how to keep your military unit alive when the temperature drops below freezing and everyone is wet.
Right. Hypothermia is the real enemy.
Exactly. Kai was the guy who knew how to keep the fires burning. He knew how to prevent frostbite. He knew how to keep his men combat effective in the most brutal, unforgiving conditions imaginable.
He was the ultimate survivalist holding the northern line.
Bear Grylls with a broadsword.
Exactly. That makes complete sense. And it brings us to the actual combat record preserved in these archaic poems, because the text explicitly mentions his involvement in the Battle of Tryfrwyd, or
Tryfrwyd, yes.
which took place on the River Forth. And Kai is the central dominant figure in this conflict.
Which perfectly aligns with the geography we've been tracking all episodes.
Yeah.
The scholarly consensus places the Battle of Tryfrwyd near modern-day Stirling.
Right. And as we established in our deep dive into the King's Knot back in episode 3, Stirling is geographically the gateway to the Highlands.
The ultimate choke point.
Exactly. It is the precise geographical choke point where a professional Votadini army would naturally intercept a massive invasion force coming south.
It completely shifts how you view Arthurian battles. I mean, we aren't talking about honorable jousts on a sunny, manicured field with ladies dropping handkerchiefs.
It's far from it.
No.
Yeah.
The Battle of Tryfrwyd was a seasonal meat grinder. It was a brutal, desperate, suffocating clash of shield walls in the mud and the freezing water of the River Forth.
In the freezing water, yeah.
The poets of this era, the sin-feared bards like Aneurin and Taliesin, they didn't write about chivalry or courtly love because those concepts didn't exist yet. They were essentially war correspondents.
They were writing casualty reports.
Exactly. They measured a leader's value strictly in body counts, looted weapons, and border security.
The brutal metrics of survival.
The poetry explicitly states that Kai's blade slain them by the hundreds. It's an oral ledger of his kill count. He was valued, revered even, because he kept the monsters, the very real, violent human threats at bay, so the farmers in the South could harvest their crops.
The poetry gives us the bloody psychological reality of his campaigns. But what I find truly fascinating, and what really cements this investigation, is that the landscape itself provides the geographical receipts of his existence.
The receipts are carved in stone.
Literally. If you drive through the Lothians and the Scottish borders today, you are driving through a landscape that is heavily branded with this man's history. Din Aiden, the cat stain in Midlothian, Traprain Law.
And the stone.
And, of course, the monolith we mentioned at the very beginning of the show, the Keystone.
The Keystone. It's an 11-foot-high prehistoric pillar stone weighing tons, sitting right on the outskirts of modern Edinburgh.
Now, in the spirit of academic rigor, we have to acknowledge the alternative theories in the source material.
Sure, we have to present all sides.
Some modern linguists argue that KC might derive from the Old English word side, meaning a slope or a hillside.
A hillside, right.
Others suggest it might be a corruption of Coleman's stone, referring to a later religious figure.
You have to address the counter-arguments, sure. But you also have to look at the macro context of where this stone is actually located.
Right. It sits remarkably close to a site identified on old ordnance survey maps as an ancient British camp.
A military camp.
Exactly. And it is located right in the visual shadow of Arthur's Seat, the massive volcanic hill overlooking Edinburgh, which the old Cumbric texts refer to as Minute Aiden.
Minute Aiden.
And despite the academic debates, the persistent, centuries-old local folklore stubbornly anchors it to Keystone.
And this brings us back to one of the core concepts of this entire investigation, the toponymic palimpsest.
Explain the palimpsest concept for us, because it's vital to understanding how history survives.
Well, a palimpsest was originally a piece of parchment where the monks scraped off the old ink to write something new, but you could still see the faint traces of the original writing underneath.
The ghostwriting.
Right. Now, toponymy is the study of place names. So a toponymic palimpsest is like formatting a hard drive. The Anglo-Saxons moved into this territory and tried to install their own cultural operating system.
They rename everything.
They renamed rivers and towns. But the underlying Brittonic data, the names of the massive mountains and the ancient standing stones, was embedded so deep in the cultural sector that it couldn't be entirely erased. It just got adopted and slightly mispronounced.
So you have this massive, incomprehensible ancient structure, this megalith that was already thousands of years old when Kai was actually alive. Why attach his name to it?
Well, what is the human impulse when faced with something massive and ancient that you didn't build?
You claim it.
You attach it to your most dominant, powerful, local hero. His successors, the people he protected, used that ancient stone as a permanent territorial marker. It became a fossilized memory of his defensive line.
Picture the Votadini command structure at the Fortress of Edinburgh. You are holding the frontier against impossible odds. Setting up names like Keystone or Arthur's Seat isn't just about honoring a dead general.
No, it's highly functional.
It acts as a psychological boundary marker against the encroaching Anglo-Saxons. It's geographic propaganda.
Absolutely.
It says to any invading army, the Titan who slaughters armies held this line. This is his stone. Proceed at your own risk.
It roots the myth into the literal bedrock of Scotland. But here's where the investigation takes a really sharp, highly suspicious turn.
Oh, the genealogy.
Yes, because if all of his physical markers, his battle sites, and his tactical operations are so heavily rooted in the Scottish Lothians, how did his family tree end up completely relocated to southwest Wales?
This was the biggest contradiction I found in the sources. The genealogical divergence is glaring.
It's absurd, really.
If you read the later standardized Welsh traditions, the ones that eventually influenced the medieval writers, they will tell you that Kay's father is a man named Sinner Seinfarfog.
Sinner the Fairbearded?
Sinner the Fairbearded. And they place his ancestral home firmly in the Kingdom of Dyfed, down in the southwest corner of Wales.
Which, geographically, is about as far away from Edinburgh as you can get while still being on the same island.
Exactly.
And it is incredibly convenient for the Welsh kings of Dyfed to claim Arthur's greatest warrior as a local boy.
Extremely convenient. But if you go back to the older, unpolished northern sources texts, like the boned Guriri Goguld, which translates to the descent of the men of the north, you get a completely different, much older story.
A real story.
The northern tradition says his father is Sinwyd Sinwydian and that he descends directly from the lineage of Cole Hen.
We need to emphasize who Cole Hen was to understand the stakes here.
King Cole.
Right, old King Cole. The Coling dynasty essentially controlled the entirety of the Old North. Their various family branches ruled Red, Elmet, and Gododin.
The whole map.
The whole map. If Kai was a member of this specific clan, he wasn't just a tough mercenary soldier that Arthur hired off the street.
Yeah.
He represented a massive, high-level military alliance across the disparate Brittonic kingdoms.
He was a prince.
He was royalty. His presence in Arthur's retinue was the political glue holding the entire northern defense together.
So we have a massive historical discrepancy. How does a prince of the Scottish borders become a nobleman of southwest Wales?
The historical mechanism for this is a concept we can call weaponized folklore.
Weaponized folklore.
And the catalyst for it is the migration of a figure named Cwned Willig.
Let's break down how weaponized folklore actually works in a predominantly oral society. Because they aren't just logging onto Wikipedia and editing a page.
Right. They don't have printing presses to recall. As the northern kingdoms were slowly crushed and absorbed by the expanding Anglo-Saxon power of Northumbria, the Brittonic elites had to flee.
They were pushed to the edge of the sea.
They migrated south into Wales. When they arrived, they brought their retinues, their families, and most importantly, their bards and their stories. They were high-status refugees, but they were still refugees.
And they needed a place to stay?
Exactly. And the local Welsh dynasties recognized the immense cultural power of these northern heroes. The stories of Arthur, of Kai, of the great tragic battles against the darkness that was incredibly potent propaganda.
It's currency.
Yes. So how do you rewrite a genealogy? Local bards, who rely on the patronage of the Welsh kings to survive, simply start singing a different version of the song at the feast.
They just changed the lyrics.
They amputate Kai's northern roots. They stop singing about Cole Hen, and they graft Kai onto the local family tree of Dyfed to legitimize their own Welsh rulers.
It's essentially cultural theft, born out of political necessity.
That's exactly what it is.
But the brilliant thing about oral history is that the original truth always leaves forensic clues behind. The rewrite is never perfect.
It's sloppy. What do you find in the sources?
Let's look at Kai's horse.
His horse.
Yes, in the ancient triads of Britain, which catalog the great people, places, and objects of the island, his horse is specifically named Gwynno Gweta Duff, her chestnut longneck.
Okay, a named horse. Why is that the forensic clue?
Because of where the horse is cataloged in the text, it is listed right alongside the steeds of known, historically verified Gododin aristocrats.
Aye.
Men like Clydno Aiden and Sinon ap Clydno. You don't just randomly group a Welsh servant's horse with the royal steeds of the Gododin elite.
No, you don't. That is the ultimate receipt. You do not invent a highly specific named equestrian pedigree and place it alongside real historical northern kings for a fictional servant from Wales.
It makes no sense.
The horse proves the geography.
Hmm.
Kai belonged to the exact same equestrian warrior elite described in the famous poem Why Gododin.
It really highlights the tragedy of the Gwr y Gogledd, the men of the north.
It's heartbreaking, really.
The cultural trauma of losing the Hen Ogledd was profound. They were forced into a generational exile, and they carried their oral history with them like stolen cargo. And when they got to Wales, that cargo had to be unpacked, modified, and replanted to suit their new political reality.
But the Welsh adaptation, as self-serving as it was nothing compared to the complete and utter literary assassination that was waiting for Kai a few centuries later on the continent.
Oh, the French romances.
The Welsh at least remembered him as a massive hero and a warrior, even if they changed his zip code. The French romances utterly destroyed him.
Let's trace that evolutionary drift because it happens in distinct, fascinating stages. It's like watching the devolution of a character in real time.
Let's hear it.
Stage 1, we have the historical reality. The sub-Roman officer Caius, holding the Votadini buffer zone with Roman hacksilver.
Right, the boots on the ground. The real guy.
Stage 2, the archaic monster slayer of the early poetry. The giant of the Hen Ogledd defending Edinburgh against the dogheads.
The oral history phase, full of hyperbole.
Exactly. Then stage 3, the transition into Middle Welsh literature. If you read tales like Colich and Olwen, he is still depicted as a massive hero with magical abilities, but he starts to develop a distinct flaw.
The personality shift.
Right. He gets an acid tongue, he becomes grim, short-tempered, and insulting.
And that Middle Welsh phase is the crucial psychological bridge. Because we have to remember, in the Old North, having a cold heart and a grim, ruthless nature weren't considered character flaws.
They were required.
They were supreme virtues. If you were standing in the mud at the River Forth, surrounded by enemies trying to slaughter your people, you do not want a polite, well-spoken diplomat holding the line.
You want a monster.
You need a killer. You need a man with a cold heart who can slaughter without hesitation to protect the borders.
But then we hit the 12th century, and these gritty survival stories reached the incredibly wealthy, pampered courts of France.
The worst thing that could have happened to him.
Enter Chrétien de Troyes, the superstar writer of his day.
And the cultural needs of the audience completely shift. Think about the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine.
They aren't shivering in the mud.
No, they are sitting by warm fires drinking wine. They don't want to hear stories about starving men freezing in the mud and decapitating raiders in the bogs of Scotland. They want Finamore.
Courtly love.
Exactly. They want polished armor, extravagant tournaments, delicate manners, and knights pledging eternal devotion to married queens.
They want soap operas with swords.
That's brilliantly put. Soap operas with swords.
And this exposes the ultimate hypocrisy of the French romances. Because as the aristocratic audiences craved these new, civilized continental knights figures, like Lancelot, who, by the way, was entirely invented for this specific purpose by Chrétien,
Completely made up out of thin air.
they needed a foil. Lancelot needs to look incredibly noble, polite, and morally superior. How do you do that from a narrative perspective?
It's easy. You take the oldest, most foundational warrior in the mythos, the gritty, practical northern warlord, and you demote him.
You tear him down.
You turn the grim necessity of his historical personality into a punchline.
You turn Kai, the giant slayer, the Magister Draconium, into Sir Kay, the boorish, incompetent seneschal.
The seneschal. The party planner.
You literally make him the guy who manages the kitchen, counts the bread, and yells at the squires. It is blatant class warfare in literature.
It is the brutal reality of historical PR.
It's sickening.
If you survive the meat grinder of the 5th century, holding the literal gates of civilization against the dark, the 12th century poets will just turn you into middle management to make their new fictional golden boy look good.
Just absolutely disrespectful.
The degradation of Kay's character perfectly mirrors the historical erasure of the Hen Ogledd itself. The real bleeding history was too ugly, too practical, and too grim for the continental courts, so it was overwritten with fairy tales.
It's deeply tragic. The man who actually bled to protect the historical roots of the legend, the man whose supreme military competence allowed the sub-Roman society to survive long enough to even have legends in the first place, becomes the joke of the fictionalized Britain.
Which brings us back to why this specific deep dive matters so much.
Why we're doing this.
We aren't just correcting a minor typo in a medieval manuscript or arguing over a translation. We are recovering a stolen identity.
So let's synthesize the case file here for you before we wrap up. When we strip away the layers of continental romance, the perfumed courts, and the Welsh genealogical theft, what are we actually left with?
The raw data.
Right. The linguistic data of the name Caius points directly to a sub-Roman aristocratic class utilizing imperial authority. The earliest archaic poetry, Pagur, explicitly places him at the fortress of Din Aiden and fighting brutal skirmishes on the River Forth.
It checks out geographically.
The unedited northern genealogies tie him to the dominant Cole-Hen dynasty, giving him immense political weight. And the toponymy, from the Keystone to Arthur's Seat, proves that his memory was permanently etched into the physical landscape of the Lothians.
All the forensic evidence points to one inescapable reality.
What's the verdict?
Kai Feb Senor was not a petty Welsh servant, and he was certainly not a bumbling French knight. He was the premier Romanized military commander of the Votadini. He was the gatekeeper of the north.
He was the man standing in the dark, keeping the fires burning, holding the line so that the very idea of a kingdom could survive the collapse of the Roman world.
That's his real legacy.
And the fact that we can still trace his physical footprint in the monoliths near Edinburgh today is a testament to just how monumental his actual historical presence must have been.
Which raises an important, frankly uncomfortable question that I want you to think about as we wrap up this investigation.
Leave them with this.
We've just spent this time looking at how easily a giant slayer, the literal gatekeeper of a nation, was intentionally erased. He was rewritten into a bumbling, spiteful servant just to suit the political and cultural tastes of a new, wealthier regime.
A total rewrite.
It was a complete, highly successful rewrite of history that lasted for nearly a millennia. So if they could so thoroughly erase and degrade the true identity of Arthur's greatest, most historically grounded general, what other foundational figures in our history books are just political fiction, designed to hide a much darker, much older truth?